Greetings and aloha. I'm Bodhi B, coming to you from the slopes of Haleakala Crater here on Maui, Hawaii. And this is Death Tracks. Join us as we follow tracks, make tracks, and listen to musical tracks as we wander and wonder in the fields of conscious living and dying, and we contemplate the endings of what is dying in the world. We will die, and we don't know when. Everyone we love and care about will die, and we don't know when. How and whether we use this information will shape the course of our lives, our relationships, and our attunement to the sacred. It will shape who we are as a community and how we care for each other now and when we are dying. Thank you for joining us. Thank goodness for nature. Thank God for nature. I am so nurtured and fed by nature and the wild. Thank God for the wild. Thank God for all the critters. Nature is the greatest teacher I've found about life and death, where they dance together in this beautiful, unchoreographed, choreographed flight of fancy. This is Death Tracks, where we follow tracks, make tracks, and listen to musical tracks as we explore in the fields of aging, dying, death, a wisdom, elders, what is dying in the world, how are love and grief, sisters, twins. How do we live with the truth that impermanence, that we will die and we don't know when, and everyone we love will die and we don't know when. And how do we manage to be creative and live in beauty and sacred way and have fun in the midst of the impermanence of our lives and everything else.
All good things gotta come to an end. The thrills have to fade before they come round again. The bills will be paid and the pleasure will mend. All good things gotta come to an end. God, I wish I was home, laying around with my friends. The call of the wild, caution thrown to the wind. The fall of the child, where the longing begins. All good things gotta come to an end. Like a river flows rolling till it ends in the sea. High pleasure grows, rolling till it ends in you and me. Now as the dark gathers into the sky, and legions of might go thundering by, regions of light grow dim and then die, and we with our wings wait for morning to fly. Like a river flows, rolling till it ends in the sea. Our pleasure grows, rolling till it ends in you and me. Here where the angels have appeared and are gone, your face like an ember glows in the dawn. But I want you to remember, all wild deeds live on, all good times, all good friends, all good things gotta come to an end. The thrills have to fade before they come round again. The bills will be paid and the pleasure will mend. All good things gotta come to an end. All good times, all good friends, all good things gotta come to an end.
Jackson Browne, one of my heroes. And Ram Dass, he's also one of my heroes. Ram Dass and I got to travel a ways together. He was with Leilani, my wife, at the beginnings of our nonprofit Doorway into Light, which in some very important ways was about carrying on Ram Dass's work that he had started with the dying and with conscious dying and what that is, and in actually designing and imagining what a dying center could look like for people that wanted to do the work of waking up in their dying time, and for people who could hold that space and care for people in that way and see them in that way and be in that way with dying people, and also able to hold the suffering and the breakdown and the loss and the grief and the brokenheartedness. Wow, I just described our Doorway into Light certified death doulas. Some years back, Ram Dass and I drove around looking for land on Maui to develop that dying center, the vision that the two of us shared, and many others. And our nonprofit organization, educational and charitable organization, Doorway into Light, is now, we started in 2006, and now it's 2021. And we continue in so many ways of educating and counseling and supporting dying people and their families. We're educating the community and including death in life, to make friends with death and dying, that we're all going to die, and to allow that to be actually a real gift, and give to us recognition and embodiment of how precious and fragile it all is. And two, we've been operating Hawaii's only nonprofit funeral home, certified green funeral home in Hawaii, since 2012. So, and Ram Dass, though he's not in his body, is still on our board, is still one of our guiding directors and lights in furthering the work of transforming culture, transforming the consciousness of humanity, really, and having a living, honest, healthy relationship with our own approaching death. This is a very quick way to come out of the cultural hypnotic sleepwalk so many of us find ourselves in. We are a placeholder, one of the tent poles in the community tent, and our placeholder is that death is present in the community, that death is part of community life, that death is present and at the dining room table. So I'd like to play a early recording of Ram Dass giving a lecture on his perspectives on death. And I believe this is from 1970s when he gave this talk.
My topic is perspectives on death, which is an interesting topic to present in a hospital because, as we all understand, a hospital is committed to the preservation of life. It's interesting that the roles one finds oneself in a hospital require that you fulfill that commitment to the preservation of life. What that role entails with regard to your attitude towards death, however, is another matter. And very often we sometimes mass together the idea that preservation of life must see death, therefore, as a failure or as the enemy or as lost. And that is a very common predicament in the medical community. It's interesting that you live out here in this beautiful country where you watch the seasons change, and you don't feel it's a failure of the tree when it drops its leaves, and you don't feel it's a failure of the tree when it grows old and it falls over and it turns back into the earth and nurtures future trees. You have a sense of the continuity of nature. But there is some way in which the role of the medical community starts to find itself pitted against a certain kind of rhythm of life and death, a certain kind of appropriateness or harmony in the way of things. And it's raising, especially now with technology developing as it is, a number of ethical and moral issues, but also issues, I think, that are internal problems for the medical community in terms of frustration, in terms of really burnout, I think. I'd like to reflect about that issue a little bit with you today. I arrived at this interest in this issue in a somewhat backdoor way, not as a psychologist particularly, but as a spiritual seeker who had gone to India. In the course of my studies over there, I began to see that people in different cultures, different religious traditions, had a different philosophical underpinning about the meaning of a life and thus the meaning of a death. And they were able to see life and death as part of a process in which death had its own harmony. And I even realized that in the East, in the more intense religious traditions, like among the Buddhist monks, for example, they saw life as a preparation for the moment of death. Now, we don't see that at all here. We see that death, because we are living in what is primarily, even though most of us have had some religious training and we give at least lip service and some heart service to Christianity or to whatever religious tradition we have, we still are primarily philosophical materialists. That when you are dead, you're dead. And we say, well, it's a mystery beyond that. But we are not very deeply rooted in the sense of the continuity of spirit, of continuity of soul. And when you come to a tradition in which the dominant theme is the continuity of awareness before birth and after death, the meaning of a life and death is quite different. And the way in which one approaches death is very different. The experience that I had that was very dramatic for me was when I first went to India. I had the Western model pretty much, even though I'd had these experiences of a sense of awareness independent of body. I went to Benares, which is known as the city of dying in India. It's one of the most sacred cities in India. And there on the streets are many lepers, people with advanced cancer, people with huge goiters, with all kinds of problems, often with just a loincloth, enough money on their loincloth for the wood for their funeral pyre, and a begging bowl. And I was walking through the streets with my American Express traveler's checks, and with a sense of pity, with a sense of the horrendous nature which you feel often when you're in India about the economics, about the starvation, about all of that. And as a Westerner would say, gee, this place is in terrible shape. We ought to do something about it. Somebody ought to do something about it. I was so pained by it that I went back to my hotel. I didn't even want to stay on the streets. It was just too painful to think about these people. Shortly thereafter, I met my spiritual teacher, and I ended up spending the winter in a temple in India. And I became steeped in the philosophy and the religious stance of the people. And when I came back about 5-6 months later to Benares again, I walked down the street with an entirely different perceptual stance regarding what was going on, because I realized that these people had come from all over India in order to die in Benares. To die in Benares and get burned by the Ganges River in Benares is the most auspicious thing a Hindu person can do. It assures that they are liberated at that moment. It's such a deep belief system that when I had quieted down through this training, I looked into their eyes, which I had averted my gaze before. I looked into their eyes, and I saw them looking back at me in a completely calm and present way. And in fact, some of them were looking at me with pity. And at first, that shook me until I realized they saw me as somebody who was confused, wandering around the world, somewhat lost in what my life was about, while they knew exactly what their life was about, and they were at home, and they were perfectly centered and structured in their life. And I began to see that the philosophical stance a person had affected very dramatically how they met their death and how they approached their death. And I further saw, as I studied Buddhism, I noticed that, for example, the Theravadan Buddhists, the monks are given meditations in which, in the old days, the bodies of Buddhists were thrown into the cemetery and they were eaten by the birds. And the monks were usually sent to the cemetery for nights, all night, to sit and meditate on the decaying body, on the fly-infested corpse, on the bloated body, on the skeleton. And they did these meditations in order to, in a way, loosen their attachment to the body and to see the ephemeral or changing nature of the body. The purpose was to let go of the attachment to the concept of life as the body, so that they would keep their consciousness right in the moment. And so the dying process, instead of being filled with "I'm dying" or "don't let me die," they would merely be attentive to the moment of as each process unfolded in the moment. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, the monk is trained to notice exactly the processes that are going on at the moment of dying, not to be drugged into unconsciousness, but to stay very, very clear. And for example, they notice in their system, they notice as the earth element changes, they feel the heaviness and they note heaviness. As the water element leaves, they note dryness and they note it as dryness. They keep their consciousness focused on just what's happening at the moment. As they say, as the fire element leaves, they notice coldness. And as the air element leaves, they notice the out-breath as longer than the in-breath. In other words, they watch the processes of death. And instead of coming back into their minds of "I'm dying," which is a thought away from where the action is, They stay right with the process itself as it's going. And you find that a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the struggle has to do with the concept that the person has about what's happening. Not what's happening, not the dying process itself. I mean, many of us, I've worked with many, many people, as I'm sure most of you have, as the moment that they die. Some of them are struggling terribly hard because they have a model in themselves that this is loss and failure that's terribly frightening. And yet I'm sure many of you have been present with people who die where there is a release, an opening, a letting go, a feeling of rightness, of just tuning, of support, which often leaves the doctor and the nurse feeling privileged to be present or feeling grace to be part of this somewhat mysterious process in which this transformation occurred with there is living spirit and suddenly the body is dead and there's no spirit there and something has gone and it stays right at the edge of the unknown. I saw that in the East there was such a lightness about death. I mean, there are Zen poems like a Zen master is dying and he's supposed to write a poem before he dies. That's what Zen masters do. And his students came up and they said, "You haven't written your poem." And he says, "Oh my goodness, hand me my quill." And he calligraphies. And it says, "Birth is thus, death is thus, verse on no verse, what's the fuss?" Which I always thought should be followed by Burma shave, but it sounded like another monk who they brought him his favorite cake as he was dying, and then they leaned over to hear his final mystical words, and his final mystical words is, "My, this cake is good." And Ramana Maharshi, the Indian saint, who was dying, and his devotees were crying and said, "Don't leave us, don't leave us." And he looked confused. He said, "Don't be silly. Where could I go? I'm just dropping my body." Now, the term dropping the body is an Indian concept. It says that who I am is not what's dying. I am just dropping, I'm selling my Ford, in effect. No, don't sell your Ford. Don't sell your Ford, you see. Now, in a way, it shifts the nature of the experience of dying, because at that point, the minute you identify with some component in yourself which is not that which dies, you then approach death as a transformational experience rather than an ending experience. It's no different than puberty. I mean, you can imagine collecting baseball cards and then coming into puberty and you say, "I'm never going to give up these baseball cards." And then a moment later, they're quite irrelevant just because of something happened in your endocrine system and your whole psyche changed. Well, roughly, this is the way death is seen. It's just seen as a transition. You understand it's based on the recognition, which has to come ultimately through some direct experience, the recognition that you are more than your physical body. That doesn't cover all of it. And a lot of that thought process has been relegated to the church and relegated to a Sunday morning or an interesting thought. But when you come into the medical community, you continually identify the body with the person. Now, we made one leap when we went from treating the ultimate in dying, seeing that as the ICU as the best place to die, in which the body was treated as the major focus, and the psychology was treated as somewhat irrelevant. We won't have any dogs and cats and children in here because it will upset the medical support system. Then we moved to hospice started to become a thought in the world, coming from Cecily Saunders and St. Christopher's in England, and it came over, and it slowly come through work of people like Elizabeth Ross. The whole idea that there was a psychological individual that was dying, and could we create a support system to make that a little less painful for the psychological person by giving them a support system, helping them often to die at home among loved ones, giving them some feeling of control, of psychological control, or even in intensive care units, bringing in more warmth and more human, in other words, honoring the psychology as well as preserving the body. Now that's a shift in focus and in emphasis in the medical community. And that's happened reasonably painlessly in a very few years, by the way, in this culture. But the work I'm interested in goes one step further than that, because it's really focused on the you will, a spiritual awareness of an individual, because I saw that the people in the East, at least the most evolved ones, saw their death as a transformation, and they saw it as a vehicle through which they could awaken more out of that identification. They could break the identification through the process of watching their own death and staying in an environment where other people were not, if you will, sucking them in or catching them in the identification with their body. So I decided to set up a Benares of the West, so to speak, and I set up a thing which I, without euphemism, just called the Dying Center. And the Dying Center was a place where people could come who wished to use their dying process as a vehicle for deepening their spiritual understanding of their own identity. That is, loosening the hold of identification with their body through the process of dying. Now, who's going to staff that? Because what you're trying to do is put that person, that patient, in an environment in which the people around that person are not going to keep catching them in the drama of dying, because the drama of dying is the biggest drama going in town. I mean, it sucks everybody in. There's hardly anybody that doesn't get caught in that one. You may stay very, very calm until it comes to the moment of dying, and then everybody's around. I was with teaching with Elizabeth Ross, and there was a 28-year-old nurse. Since she had been 6 years old, she'd been having operations for cancer. There were dozens of operations. She had 3 or 4 children. She was now 29 or 30. She's been a very active woman. She was a nurse. And she was often in the hospital as a patient. And she said to us as the group, "What would you feel like if you came to visit me?" And then Elizabeth wrote on the board all the answers, and people said things like, "I would feel angry at the universe for having put you through this. I would feel pity. I would feel," and a whole set of emotional reactions to the fact that this woman was in this condition. And she says, "Do you see my predicament?" She said, "Nobody was with me. Everybody was with my symbolic identity. Everybody saw a 28-year-old nurse with 3 or 4 children who was dying of cancer. And I was completely in here screaming, is anybody out there? Does anybody hear me? Because nobody was with me as a fellow human being, because my symbolic value was so powerful." Do you hear that issue at all? That, I mean, when somebody is very, very famous or very, very powerful or very rich or very beautiful in the culture, they are really at an interesting disadvantage. It's very hard for them to make real connections with people because people are so awed by this symbolic value. And people keep responding to the symbol and don't let them in as fellow human beings. And people stop. So we decide in the Dying Center to people it with people like me, because I am somebody who wants to spiritually awaken, and I realize that the thing that keeps people most asleep in spiritual life is their identity with their separateness and their fear of death, therefore. And therefore, if I really want to awaken, I want to push myself as hard as I can, and the thing that's going to push my buttons the most as a human being is to be in the presence of dying. So that I would like to be around dying people as work on myself. The dying people come to use their dying as work on themselves. In other words, we are creating a monastery or an ashram in which all the people are there in order to awaken, and the vehicle that they're working with is the dying process. In other words, instead of the focus being on stopping the dying or anything, the focus is on awakening. Now, what happened, of course, was that people came to the Dying Center, and it was such a nice place to be, they didn't die. And, I mean, you can't make people promise to die, and you've only got so many beds, and so we had to change the title to the Living Dying Center because we were faced with this problem.
That was Ram Dass, early 1970s, one of his earlier speaking about death, dying, and dying in this culture. and his experience of seeing dying in India. This is an interview I recently did with a woman named Elizabeth Fournier, a funeral director that operates a funeral home in Boring, Oregon. She's another one of the leaders in this death positive movement in transforming how we approach dying and death and the care of the dead here in the West.
I have the pleasure of being able to do things my way, sort of like you. There's a calling. When you get to follow it, it really feels like things are cooking on all four burners. I've been in the death industry for 29 years, and I'm now working at a repurposed goat barn in Boring, Oregon. And fortunately, where I am able to place people to rest in the loving embrace of their own land. Private property burials are something I can do. I spend a lot of time doing that and spending time with families and allowing them to do it their own way. And it's really, I had no idea this is where I was going to be led, but I cannot go backwards at this point. This is just everything.
So you're a funeral director with a funeral home and a goat barn?
Yes. When you walk into the chapel area, that's where the hay was in the loft area. So people do say this structure looks sort of familiar, and it actually is a repurposed goat barn.
How cool. I love it already. So I wish the county and state would streamline the process here for home burial on private property. And while it is legal, they've set up all kinds of speed bumps and roadblocks in the process of creating what's called a family burial ground here in Hawaii. And there are plenty of them already that have from Hawaiians who've been buried in people's backyards and people's homes for a very, very long time. And those are kind of grandfathered in, but now people are approaching me about home burial. So do you tell us a little bit about that? Because to me, that seems such an important piece.
It sure is. You know, I've always worked for corporate funeral homes, and then I had the pleasure of coming out to the country. Not very long after I'd been in Boring, I received a call from a family who lived down the road, and they were having their loved one die. She lived on an intentional community, and they said, we want to keep her here. There's really no reason for her to go to a cemetery. Let's make this happen. And at that point, oh my goodness, I had no idea how to get a permit, how we could make this happen. I was transparent with the family, and we worked together as a tribe. We figured it out, and it was the most amazing burial. Everything about it was incredible. So from there, families were coming forward and saying, can you help us do this? Are you that crazy lady in the country that buries people in their yards? So fortunately, it's legal where I am. And people
do you have to be related? Do you have to be related
to what they want to do? They have to really be committed to it.
Do you, here in Hawaii, to be buried in a family burial plot, you've got to be basically a legal family member. Is that true where you are?
No, you just have to have permission of the landowner. And whoever owns the land can't create their own cemetery where they legally name it, they charge money, do things like that. But if they have at least 1 acre and it's in the rural area, they can go ahead and have whomever they want. And, of course, we follow restrictions. We don't have somebody too close to a watershed or to electric or the neighbor's building. But ultimately, if there's lots of land also where you are too, lots of open land, people are saying, why do I have to buy that spot at the cemetery down the street? And guess what? You don't.
Is that true throughout the state of Oregon?
No, how it works in a lot of states, as you know as well, it's really kind of per county. So where we are in Oregon, many counties say, yeah, as long as you're in rural places, you can do this. And what I've told people is if you want to do this, no matter where you are, call your local zoning department, ask the questions, run your address past them. And what I'm finding even in Oregon, more and more times, I'll find some remote county someplace, a family wants to have a burial, and there's nothing on the books. Where somebody says, well, I'm not sure, call the zoning department. Well, why don't you call Vital Records? Call the health department, call the city, and pretty soon there's nothing on the books, so to us, that's 2 thumbs up.
Beautiful. I'm home burial ground envious here. Why don't you describe for us?
You live in Hawaii, so everyone's envious of you.
Okay, fair enough. Why don't you describe for us what somebody comes to you and maybe they're dying or maybe the family member is dying, and why don't you walk us through a story like that and to all the way to burial in the backyard, please?
Sure, absolutely. I had a man who had a wife passing, and her plan was to be buried in her lilac bushes in the backyard. He came to me and said, I think I can do this because I read some articles you wrote, and I made a call, and they said it's good, but he said, I really don't know what to do. I think it sounds fun in theory, but the reality is, how do I dig a space? All of these things. So I jumped in his old rambly truck. We went up the dirt road. He showed me the house. And he said, what do you think? This is a space we're thinking about doing that. I said, great. Everything looks good. All of the rules, for instance, you're following all that. However, now we have to make a team come together. You really have to get your people, your village. And we need to find out who is going to dig the space. Is it going to be a backhoe? Is it going to be a shovel? What will this situation look like when she passes away? The wife was going to be in the house. She was under hospice care. Let's go ahead and make sure we know who's going to sign the death certificate. Let's make sure how we can get the permit. I said, what do you want her buried in? Does somebody have to make a box? And he said, no, there's this tapestry on the wall, and it's wool, and we're going to go ahead and have her in that. Pretty soon, people started assembling. The woman died the next day. I got all the paperwork together. I went to the house, and everybody organically sort of knew what to do. Somebody was making food. Somebody was painting her toenails, her favorite shade of purple. Somebody was playing music. And little by little, there was some bath water and some lavender. When the sun was setting and the time was right, there was a little makeshift cart. She was placed into this, and out she went to her favorite lilacs. There were some words said, and everything was perfect. It's amazing how we can plan and plan and plan for traditional burials. We can spend all the money, but I find these sort of homespun services where it's all about heart and soul and love, just everything falls into place exactly how it needs to.
Wow, that's a beautiful description, and to be able to die at home and go right from the home in a little unmotorized cart out to the backyard and be buried in a hole in a tapestry, maybe a fairly shallow hole with family and friends around. Wow, that's about as beautiful as it gets.
Yeah, now the husband can go out every evening and sit amongst the beautiful lilac and think of his wife, and he just thought this is what she would have wanted. The only thing he regrets is he wanted to be able to paint the house purple before she passed away, but she died a little bit more suddenly than thought of. So, but hey, best intentions. We all try.
Not
he did
bad.
Something great.
Not bad for his only regret.
Yeah, it could have been much worse, right?
Yeah, as far as regrets go, that's in the minor scale. So tell us, I have some familiarity with the Green Burial Council, and clearly it's made huge strides since Joe started it years ago, or I'm pretty sure he started it. And tell us about what's happening, say on a national level, in terms of green burial grounds and the movement, the death positive movement, from where you're sitting.
Well, more and more cemeteries are deciding that rather than maybe have that acre, that they're going to have a hybrid situation where they have the traditional burials, and now they're going to have this undeveloped acre that maybe isn't so attractive. It's marshy or it's kind of off in the
There's one
bushes.
just like that. There's one just like that
Right.
on near where I live. Oh, and not even an acre.
Yeah, a lot of cemeteries are sort of designating land to it. What we're finding, too, especially places here like Portland, we have cemeteries that are saying you can come in any space you want in the whole entire cemetery, you can have a natural burial. That's pretty amazing if you think about that. You could be in a shroud or in a basic pine box amongst somebody's monuments or headstones or really wherever you want to be, the pioneers who've lived here in town. Also, something new on the front as well is Pope Francis loves green burial. He is a huge advocate of it. He loves the nature. He loves simplicity. He likes saving the green of the earth as well as the green in people's wallets. And so with him coming in, many, many Catholics are embracing green burial, as well as many Catholic cemeteries are now putting a garden aside and saying this is something that they want to be able to do. So it's being talked about in church circles, which is pretty fantastic.
I didn't know that. Pope Francis actually said something about it?
Yeah.
Wow.
He's a fan.
Fabulous.
Will he have a green burial? I don't know. Is that very popish? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know what popish looks like.
I think it involves the Sistine Chapel. So, probably buried, entombed, possibly.
Uh-huh.
But the fact that he is talking about how simplicity and not, giving your money to big business, things like that, it's great strides. And people seem to follow along what's happening in faith sometimes. And there's Jewish families, Muslim families, they've done the concept of natural burial forever. Mm-hmm. So we're really getting back to our roots and what we did 150 years ago.
That's what I tell people. We're not inventing anything new, and we're just uncovering what the people have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, in fact. Your funeral home, do you have a crematory?
We don't have a crematory. We also don't have an embalming room.
That sounds like my funeral home.
I take care of families, whatever wishes they want, whatever they want to do. But primarily, I meet with families. I have a chapel if they want to have a visitation. What I find, too, is a lot of people like the Baha'i faith or whomever will come and want to bathe their loved one and have their own ceremonial situation without embalming. They'll want to dress. They'll want to visit, do what they need. I have families who use the chapel to shroud. I've had casket-making workshops. I've had the local senior citizens come in and do their square dance classes. Have you heard of laughter yoga? It's like a bereavement yoga.
Tell me about bereavement yoga.
Yeah, you work through your grief and your bereavement, and rather than going through some of the poses in a way of honoring the sun and the moon, you're really getting into your grief with a lot of the way your breath is going and a lot of your movements. And so I have a woman who comes in and will teach that occasionally. So there's really, there's so many things vast on the horizon. You'd be surprised to know that we have a local mortuary college, and out of the 18 seats in the school, 17 are female. I mean, this whole death industry, as we call it, is changing. I imagine you get requests for at-sea burial. And these things, again, this is nothing new. It's not a new trend. We're just realizing we have the right to ask questions and do different things.
Ocean body burial as well have been practiced for at least hundreds and hundreds of years. And it hadn't been done in Hawaii since World War II, apparently. So when I found out I could legally bury bodies in the ocean, I had to get the head of the health department to train the local vital statistics health department here to help me get a permit. And still, even though I have these big magnetic signs on the side of my truck, ocean body burials, people will walk right up to me in front of the magnetic signs and ask me if that's really legal, which I get a kick out of, given that I have these giant signs on the side of my truck. And very few people actually know that you can be buried in the ocean, your whole body. And they've been doing it on the East Coast for quite a while, and now I hear out of San Diego it's happening as well. And it's quite a beautiful to be on a boat for maybe an hour with whoever, family, friends, and the body's wrapped in a shroud on the deck, to be with that body. And as you know, for family members to participate in the whole process from the time somebody dies to where they end up, either in the ground or in the crematory or in the ocean, how important that whole piece is for people to freely and healthily grieve.
Yeah, you're very right about that. Back in the day, we would have the front parlor of your house would be the place where we'd lay somebody in state, I guess is maybe the word, even though they're not an official postulant. We would have people from the community bathe or dress or make food. People would come into the house, and it was more hands-on. We were a part of this. And then only when everybody said their goodbyes and when we were ready, we would take that loved one and bring them into the yard or down the church street to get to the graveyard there. Nowadays, we go into a funeral home and you have your allotted 1 hour for your visitation. And that's your 1 hour where you need to show up and say things you need to say and have your grieving. And that's what you do. It's not a matter of you can touch and feel and be. It feels sanitized. You smell the air freshener of the roses, all of these things that make people think, gosh, that doesn't really look like Dad. And I don't really think Mom would have really liked that dress. And, this isn't the kind of music Mom would listen to. Or I feel so weird, seeing Joe in his suit when really he wore his jeans and his overalls or whatever it is. So I think that we do kind of formalize these things, and now we're realizing it takes away the family, it takes away getting through everything as a community and really relying on each other for your grief support and just having those intimate moments, because this really is such an integral part of life.
Beautifully stated. Yeah, and I see, and we've all seen that when somebody dies, and it seems in this country for at least some time, the automatic reflex was call the funeral home. We want the body removed. We want the body out of the house as quickly as possible. And oftentimes, the next time we see that body, it's either embalmed, looking somewhat embalmed, or you're going to pick up ashes. And again, we come back to that space in between that breaks into our ability to be in the process and grieve in the process, and the support in our grieving from participating in it, as I'm sure you've seen over and over again.
Yeah, active participation. This is your life after all, darn it. And you need to be an active participant and live out loud. And when someone dies, there isn't or shouldn't be that rush of, oh, goodness sakes, I've got to call the undertaker who has to come scoop this person away because death is uncomfortable. It really isn't. We used to be born at home, and we used to die at home. But now we're in hospitals and we're in nursing homes. And a lot of times I'll get a call from a nursing home who'll say, oh, so-and-so died. And I'll say, well, would the family like to come visit? Oh, no, it's too late. We don't want to call them. There's just a sense of we don't want to inconvenience anybody. This person died. We don't want them to have to deal with it. Where you probably know this as well, that 40 out of the 50 states allow people to actually act as their own funeral director. They actually allow someone to provide their own transportation and do these things and make their own choices and not have this dictated by a funeral home general price list. It's pretty amazing, and people just don't know to ask these questions. It's what we need. But if you don't know you can ask these things or don't know what to ask, how do you get your needs met?
Beautiful. Well, I'm really glad that Oregon is one of those states. And again, I'm still in awe about this backyard graveyard. And people don't have to be blood related to be buried in your backyard where you live. Amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. Where I am in the country, we have a rescue farm of goats and sheep, and right outside my kitchen window, I have a whole green burial ground of all of the animals who've passed away, and it's everything from the bird to the goldfish to the random doe that just came through at one point into the pasture and went into the barn and just checked out. That's just where she wanted to be, was amongst the sheep. And if I can have all of these beautiful little souls outside my kitchen window that I can yell to or sing to or throw out the wild flower seeds to, it's pretty powerful when this is somebody that you had conversations with and broke bread with around a table and really was a part of your life on a day-to-day basis. That's truly amazing to know that they could just be outside your window.
How beautiful. How it ought to be everywhere. How beautiful. I'm so glad that at least you get to participate in that and facilitate that and empower families to claim what so belongs to the family. Good for you. Great work. Great work.
Thank you.
What else? What would you like to share?
Okay, there's so much more. I love to tell families that you are having the right to build or buy any sort of casket that you'd like. Families don't realize that when you go into the funeral parlor, you can not buy that metal casket. You can make something, a simple pine box. You can take the sheet off of your bed and make a shroud. Cemeteries allow these things to be placed into the ground. People don't realize that because at the funeral home, you're shown a room with caskets or a price list. You can buy something off the internet, and it's not like you bring your own wine into a restaurant and there's a corkage fee. They can't charge you any other cost for having your own cost-effective or homemade casket or alternative burial container.
I wish that were true here. You cannot be buried in a shroud in any cemetery on Maui anyways. I went around to the funeral homes here to see what they were selling casket-wise, and I wanted to see the most inexpensive casket. And you probably know this. The most inexpensive one I found on Maui was $1,500, and it was made out of particle board with toxic glue and the whole thing came from China. And of course, it wasn't by anywhere close to being the first thing they wanted me to look at. Just like, as you know, that when you walk into most funeral homes, they don't bring you to the least expensive environmental cardboard or whatever it is casket. So I started. I'm a bit of a builder and a carpenter. Well, I am, and started making these beautiful, simple pine box caskets that I sell for $500. And but I can't. I haven't found a cemetery here that will let me bury anyone in either a shroud or a cardboard box because of
not even a cardboard box. That's interesting.
Because they all use that little pulley strap system to lower the casket into the ground, and they refuse to lower anything that's not very totally stiff. So
well, what about a cardboard box or a shroud on top of a nice flat piece of pine?
Well, that's what I'm working on now. Exactly, or a piece of wood inside of a cardboard box. Yeah, exactly. I'm working on that one.
Yeah, a lowering board made of something natural. I mean, we have all of these wonderful things. We have bamboo, and we have banana leaves, and all these wonderful wicker, and that we're finding that are these textiles, this lost art in America of making these things. And these are all sustainable and biodegradable.
Beautiful. Wow, I want to come meet you and see how you do what you do, and I come through Portland, so surely I'm going to find a way to connect with you and maybe get to see how you do what you do.
My gosh, please do. I'll buy you a licorice tea at my favorite towel of tea.
Oh, that's appealing. That's reason enough. So we got on here late, and I'm kind of at the end of the show. So what I'd like to do, Elizabeth, and first pronounce your last name for us. Fournier. Oh, I was close. I didn't get the Fournier part of it, but now I got it. I'm gonna stay in contact with you, and I'd like to get you on for a whole hour next time, and continue on. This wasn't boring at all.
Yeah, it wasn't boring, and you know what, darn it, as you find out, too, there's just so much to talk about. There's so much rich conversation. I would love to spend an hour just sharing the stories and the things that families have done and what people can be inspired by to do.
I'd love that. Let's do that again. I'll get in touch with you, and we'll set another date. That's beautiful. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And thanks for reaching out about it. You're a wellspring of important information and stories, so we'll get back to that. And again, thanks for reaching out to me. So we've been speaking with Elizabeth Fournier, a funeral director, and I'm sure many other things as well, and certainly an advocate and a author, and again, another stellar personality active in this death positive, reclaiming what I say we gave away to institutions and industries. So thank you for joining us, Elizabeth.
Blessings to you. Thank you.
Okay. Aloha. Well, we've come to the end of another show. This is Death Tracks. I'm Bodie B. This is KAKU 88.5 FM, the voice of Maui, streaming on kaku.org. We're on every Tuesday from 3 to 4 p.m., rebroadcasting every Saturday morning from 9 to 10 a.m. So tomorrow, when you wake up, before you even get out of bed, say to yourself, wow, I woke up today. Wow. And you stop taking it for granted that you're entitled to wake up every day. Thanks for joining us. To find out more about our organization, Doorway into Light, a 501c3 educational and charitable organization here in Hawaii, please check out our website at www.doorwayintolight.org and check out our plans for a natural burial ground, sanctuary, and park at www.ipuka.org. That's IPUKA.org. Ipuka. Once again, I'm Bodie B, and this is Death Tracks.